Hi everybody. In this video in the economics and politics unit, we're going to look at briefly some aspects of United States politics. So in order to do that, first let's look at the definition of what politics is. So like others that we've talked about, family, school, healthcare system, politics is also a social institution. The economy is a social institution also. Politics as a social institution is a way for people in a society to decide how power gets distributed throughout that society and how to set and achieve goals. So this is what our politics is for. That sometimes gets lost in all the craziness that happens in our politics, but really that's what a political system is for, to decide how power gets distributed and how to set goals and how to achieve them. We set up a government as an organization that helps to direct those politics. So in our government, we have what's called a representative democracy, where we, the people of Illinois, send representatives that we choose by voting for them in an election to Washington, D.C. to represent the interests of the people of Illinois on a national scale. On a state level, Aurora, or parts of Aurora, parts of Naperville, parts of Chicago, parts of other cities send representatives to Springfield to advocate for the people as part of those smaller communities. So as a resident of whatever town you live in, there is a representative for you that was chosen by the people who voted in the previous election, and that person is in Springfield advocating for the things that the people who voted for them asked them to do. Okay, this is what a representative democracy is, and how most people understand the United States to operate. It certainly is structured that way. However, it's been found that the United States is not actually a representative democracy, nor is it a democracy at all. Now, I know this challenges a lot of things that we've heard and we hear and we believe about the way that our society and our system works, but this is found to be true and confirmed in multiple different studies. The first of which was done by Princeton University. And Princeton University conducted a study to ask the question, is the United States really a representative democracy? Do the elected leaders actually serve the interests of the people that elect them? And the answer to this, they found, was no. Our elected leaders do not represent the interests of the people that elect them. Instead, they represent the interests of the people that fund them. And the people that fund them are grossly disproportionate to the wealthy ownership class. So the United States is not really a democracy, according to this Princeton study and subsequent studies that confirmed the findings of the Princeton study. The United States is an oligarchy. Wealthy people in our society have the overwhelming decision-making power when it comes to our elected representatives. We can see this manifested in a whole bunch of different issues. For instance, there's some 90+% of Americans who think that if a person goes to buy a firearm, that a background check should be done to make sure that that person is a safe person to own a firearm. 90% plus of Americans think that people donating to presidential campaigns and the campaigns of other elected representatives should be public. We should know who's giving money, and there should be a limit to how much money can be given. On both of these issues and more, 90% plus of Americans think this way. But that's not what our elected officials advocate for. Because in disagreement with the vast majority of the working and American people are the very top, wealthiest, most powerful people of our society, this tiny, tiny sliver, less than 1% of our country. But it is that tiny, tiny sliver, less than 1% of our country, it's those people who have the vast majority of the money of our country and subsequently the power and influence over what our elected officials do. So that when the American people want a change to the way that our country works, we will only get it if that higher class, less than 1% group also wants that change. If they don't want that change, but the American people do,
we normally do not get that change, even though the people who are deciding to make that change or not are supposed to be representing us. Okay? So that is not the way that a representative democracy works. That is the way that an oligarchy works. When the wealthy, powerful people decide how the country is going to operate, what direction we're going to go in, what our goals are, what our intentions are, and how we're going to achieve those goals. Okay? So the United States is not, according to the Princeton study and subsequent studies that confirm this, a democracy. It is an oligarchy instead. That won't stop you from hearing in the news and your peers and other people talk about how great of a democracy the United States is. This is messaging, and again, false messaging that's communicated to give people the feeling as if they do have some sense of control over what happens in their country. The reality is that the majority of the time, they do not. Now, this isn't to tell you that voting is meaningless and that you shouldn't do it. Quite the contrary, right? Because there are people who would run for office and hold office who would listen to the people that they are meant to represent. The thing that has to happen is that when our elected officials are elected to office, and they, instead of representing us, they represent those wealthy interests, you vote them out. And you keep doing that again and again until somebody lands in there who actually represents the American people. Now, there are some politicians like this, right? I'm not going to call any specifically out by name, but there are some politicians like this who genuinely represent the interests of their constituents. But the vast majority of politicians do not do this, and instead are advocating for the interests of that wealthy group. And only when it comes time to election time do they run a bunch of commercials talking about how they're going to do the thing that the people want them to do, only to not ever do that thing once they are elected. Another way that that politicians stay in power without popular support is through gerrymandering. This may be a term that you're familiar with, but gerrymandering is a way to creatively shape a voting district to serve your interests. Here we have a graphical representation of a group of people. So pretend that this is a state or a city, and that these people are going to vote for who represents them. So if it were one big district, right, the blue squares, or people who living in these blue squares, would win. They represent the majority, 60% versus 40% red. We could divide this group of people into 5 equal sections, and in these 5 equal sections, we have representation, right? So that even though the red houses are a minority, they still get some representation, right? This is perfect representation. There is more blue people, so they get more representation, but there's some red people, so they get representation too. But you could divide it in a different way, this way. And then if you divide it this way, you only get blue representation, right? Blue wins 5 districts. Even though 40% of the people are red, none of the representatives are red, or people that they chose. They get outvoted every time. Or you can construct it this way, where even though red makes up a minority, they wind up with a majority of the representation. This is what's called minority rule. Even though there are fewer of them, they win if you creatively shape the districts as is done in this graphic here. Now this way is, this shape looks simplified, but if you look at any of the congressional maps of Illinois, of any state, you will see crazy looking congressional maps. And what's the reason why they look that way is because the politicians are doing this. Gerrymandering is a way for politicians to choose their voters instead of voters choosing their politicians. So if you're a person with an unpopular point of view, but there are still some people out there who have that point of view, but they're in a minority, you can creatively shape the district so that you win, even though a majority of the people don't agree with you. That's not representative democracy. And many, many, many congressional districts are drawn just this way, which gives power to people who otherwise shouldn't have it based on their proportional representation of the population. Another important aspect of United States politics is something that we talked about back in the culture chapter. This concept of individualism. In fact, this is one of the key, if not the key feature of United States politics. And again, it's woven into our culture. Remember, we were talking in the culture chapter, one of those key cultural values was individualism, right? That people tend to think about themselves and what's good for them only. Stop, period. Right? Not what's good for the whole, not what's good for the group, not what's good for somebody other than me, right? But me, only me and my family, the only things that I care about, right? And when people vote this way, which many people do, it has profound impacts on our society, on who our elected leaders are, and what they do once they're in office. So this idea of individualism as opposed to collectivism is a key feature of United States politics, right? That American voters tend to only vote based on what is in their specific best interests. Not the best interest of their community, not the best interest of their country, but them specifically, right? So if you are a wealthy person and it is advantageous for you to have low taxes, then you might vote for low taxes, even if that means that schools across your community are going to be underfunded. And because of that, other people are not going to get a chance to go to college, or they aren't going to get a chance to have high-paying jobs. Well, as long as I pay less taxes, who cares about them? Right? Some people would say it's a short-sighted way of thinking, because as long as you're going to live in a community, it's all of those members in the community that are going to matter. For how many of those kids who aren't given a good education and aren't given a chance to succeed, how many of them will turn to crime and maybe one day steal your car because you voted for those low taxes, right? It's just an example, but you can see this concept of individualism contrasts with the reality that when you live in a society and there's lots of people sharing that society, that we are all connected and interconnected, right? There is no pure separation of people, all right? Anyways, this is a brief video on United States politics. There's more, of course, in the textbook and other course materials. But I'd like to hear your questions or comments on this stuff. There's a section below where you can do that. I look forward to reading them.